Hi everybody, this is Lisa Johnson, the Dane County UW Extension horticulture educator, and I'm going to be talking to you today about blueberries. Blueberries are a little bit of a challenging crop for us to grow here in southern Wisconsin, mostly because of soil conditions, but also because of some other things that we'll be talking about. So I've included this slide so that you can see what blueberry flowers look like. Everybody, of course, knows what the fruit looks like, but not everyone is familiar with the flowers. The flowers are insect pollinated, and occasionally you might see one that looks like the flower at the right that has a hole punched in it from an insect that was too big to get inside the flower and found another way to get in to do the job of pollination. So blueberry production requires a couple of things. First, you need full sun. That means at least 6 to 8 hours a day for the blueberry to do its best production. And you need acid soils. So what we suggest is that you get a soil test for in-ground plots where you might be growing blueberries as well as raised beds or pots. And the reason for that is that most soils are not at the level of acidity that blueberries require. Blueberries need a pH of approximately 4.5 to 5.0, and that is on the pH scale that goes from 0 to 14, with 7 being neutral. Most of our soils here in southern Wisconsin are above neutral, so they are not appropriate for blueberries unless the soil is amended in some way. And it's hard to change a soil pH. So usually we suggest that you prepare your soil, preferably the summer or fall before planting, because it takes at least 3 months after you've added some acidifying materials for your soil pH to drop. Now, if you have a soil that is over 7.5, which is pretty far from ideal, it's going to take a pretty long time to drop. And in some soils, it's just not going to be feasible to change. When you've got a lot of carbonate in your soil, such as we who are underlain by limestone in this part of the state, you're fighting Mother Nature, and it's just really tough to change that pH. So if your soil in ground is 7.5 or higher, really recommend that you try growing blueberries in either raised beds or pots where you can control the materials that are in the soil and you can control the pH. Now, what kind of blueberries should you get? Well, there are a lot of different kinds out on the market. The half-high types, which are dwarf plants, work really well in Wisconsin. They were bred in Minnesota. Some examples are North Country, Northland, North Blue. All of those are examples of half-high types. But in some areas of the state, high bush blueberries do grow naturally, and you can grow them in some areas that have more protection for winter. Also keep in mind when you're choosing blueberry plants that you're going to need 2 cultivars for good pollination. And of course the bloom times have to overlap, otherwise you won't have the pollen available for that cross-pollination to occur. Okay, so now we'll talk about a couple different ways to prepare your soil. If you are going to be growing your blueberries in ground, you probably are going to need to use the excavation method. And again, ideally you want to do this about a year prior to planting. So you dig your hole about 24 inches deep and 18 to 24 inches wide per plant, and replace the native soil with an acid high organic matter mix. Different things you can put in your mix. Usually peat moss is going to be a desirable element to use, but do note that some sources are actually not acidic. So you may need to check on that with the provider of that product. Shredded pine needles will work, rice hulls will work, shredded dead leaves, lawn clippings, all of that should be mixed together. You don't want to use 100% of any of those items. And then you're going to want to use a sulfur source, such as pelletized sulfur or iron sulfate, as needed to achieve a pH of 4.5 to 5.0. One thing is that usually we don't recommend manure as one of the organic matter sources because usually the pH tends to be a little bit too high and can cause some issues. Okay, so if you've decided against in-ground planting because your pH is too high or other issues, then your other option is to use a raised bed or plant in a pot and then sink that pot into the soil. That's actually the method that I use in my yard, and it is pretty successful. I don't have room for raised beds, otherwise I would use that. So whether you are using either raised beds or pots, they should be at least 18 to 24 inches deep and 18 to 24 inches wide, and preferably 36 inches in the case of the beds. As we talked about earlier, you want to use an acid high organic matter mix, and again, add elemental sulfur or iron sulfate as needed to achieve that pH of 4.5 to 5.0. And pots, of course, should be sunk into the ground so that your plant is able to overwinter. A little bit more here about soil pH. As we've mentioned, a pH of 4.5 to 5.0 is recommended for blueberries. And it's a good idea to actually get your soil test done 3 months after you've created your mix and put it in your raised bed or your excavated hole or your pot, and then again 6 months after that, because again the pH is going to be lowering during that time. And if you find out at 3 months that you're not dropping the pH as quickly as you'd like to, you can add some more sulfur and save yourself the trouble of ending up 6 months down the road and still not being able to plant because your pH isn't where it should be. So do this again whether you're growing in ground or raised beds or pots. Soil test can be done through the UW Soils Lab. There are other places you can do it as well, but the Soil Lab can send you a test kit, and that will consist of some instructions on how to take a proper soil sample and a bag that you can use to mail the soil sample to the lab in Marshfield. Now be sure when you fill out those forms to say on the form that you're growing blueberries, because then the lab will know what your pH should be and they can give you a good recommendation as to how much sulfur type products you're going to need to use. I've included the phone number and the website so you can get more information. So after you've done your soil test after 3 months, if your pH is still too high, again add some sulfur at the rate indicated by your soil test and mix it in well, and then check it at 6 months. Elemental sulfur, while it is one of the very best ways to drop the pH on a longer term basis, will probably take 3 months or more to take effect. Iron sulfate, on the other hand, will drop the pH more quickly, but you need to use a lot more product in order to get the same result. I wanted to talk a little bit about soil acidification products. They're not all the same, so you do need to check ingredients. We do need to use soil acidifiers when we have a more alkaline soil, and that's necessary to prevent chlorosis. Chlorosis is what is going on with that unhealthy looking blueberry that's in the upper right hand corner. You'll note that the leaves are kind of yellowing with green veins. That's indicating that the plant is not able to pull up the nutrients that it needs from the soil because the soil is too alkaline. So we want it to be healthy and to avoid that situation. Now, when you acidify an alkaline soil, the thing is that you don't do it just once. You need to do it every year. So once you have achieved your 4.5 to 5.0 pH, what I would do is that first year I would check it again at the end of the season. And if you need to add more elemental sulfur, go ahead and do that at that time. Remember, it's going to take a while to break down and be available. So do consider that. I would check it yearly the first couple of years, and after that, maybe every other year or so. Remember that our soils that have high carbonate amounts in them are just really hard to change and maintain a high level of acidity. So one thing not to do is don't use aluminum sulfate. Aluminum becomes toxic at a pH of 5.5 or below, so that's obviously not good for our blueberry plants either. Do use elemental sulfur, which is sometimes also called soil sulfur, or you can use iron sulfate. Now, soil sulfur is going to take about 3 months to become available for your plant. Iron sulfate is a little quicker, but you need to use 6 times as much to have the desired effect. And it also provides sulfur a little bit less long term. Here's another thing to keep in mind. Your water source can actually change your soil pH if your water source is alkaline. We had that happen at our teaching garden where we were growing blueberries in raised beds. And I wondered why the pH kept rising when we were adding soil acidifiers, and finally realized that, oh, the water's probably alkaline. And I tested it, and sure enough, it was. So keep that in mind as well. You might want to use rainwater collected in a rain barrel if you've got an alkaline water source, because blueberries do need a fair amount of water. And if you have to water them often and you're just adding more alkalinity to the soil every time you do it, that's not helpful. So now we'll move on to planting and care of your blueberry plant. Most blueberries are going to be available as potted specimens, so take it out of the pot and loosen and spread the roots gently. If the roots are circling around particularly, you need to make sure to straighten them out so that they're not strangling each other. The better that you have your root system prepared, the better your plant is going to get established. Now, for the first couple of seasons, you're going to want to prune off any flower buds. So start at planting if there are flower buds and take those off. And the reason that you do that is because it costs the plant a lot of energy to flower and produce fruit. So you want it to put all its energy for the first couple of years into getting established in the soil so that it is strong enough to produce a good crop. When do you plant blueberry plants? Well, usually late April or early May is fine. Now, if there is a frost that is predicted, it's a good idea to cover your plant so that it's not affected by that. And you plant it at the same depth as the plant was in the nursery pot. Water your plant in well and make sure that the plants get 1 to 2 inches of water per week. Again, blueberry plants do like to be moist, but they don't like to be overly wet either. And if your soil mix is a little heavy, then particularly make sure that you don't overwater. You may want to get a water meter, which you can get at many different nurseries. You put the meter into the soil and it will give you a reading, and usually it has some kind of scale that tells you whether you need to water or not. Also, don't overhead water if at all possible, but water at the base of the plant. And it's a good idea to mulch in your blueberry as well. You can use hay or straw for that, and no deeper than 2 to 3 inches. Usually 2 inches is plenty. So remember I said that it's a good idea to loosen those roots. This was from, I believe it was a University of Michigan trial where halfway through the summer they noticed that their blueberries weren't doing well and they took them out and determined that it was because the plant never got well established because the roots hadn't been properly loosened and spread out into the soil. So that can happen, and you can prevent that pretty easily when you plant your plant. Fertility is important in growing blueberries, particularly nitrogen. That's the main thing that you need to worry about, and you're going to want to use an acid source of nitrogen. So ammonium sulfate is good or urea is good. Depending on how many blueberries you have, often urea comes in a fairly large size bag, but not always. Ammonium sulfate, you have sometimes the opposite problem where it seems to come in too small a bag for what you need. Now you'll note here that I have put your fertilizer applications for years 1 through 4 and then maximum amounts in the future. And so you'll note that as the plant is smaller, that you're going to want to use smaller amounts of nitrogen initially, and then it ramps up a little bit over time. And that first year, when you plant your plant in the ground or pots or raised beds, you're going to want to fertilize about a month after planting. You don't want to do it right away at planting because nitrogen can encourage a lot of leaf growth and not root growth. So you want to not do that right away. But 1 month after planting, again, usually in early June and again in early July. So I've got a total for the season of how much you should use. And I've got that handily written down there for the first 4 years plus. So blueberries do actually need a fair amount of pruning in order to remain vigorous and create a balance between vegetative vigor and fruiting for your plant's best health. The half-high bushes, even though they're dwarfs, especially are going to need more pruning, actually more than their vigorous high bush relatives. So they need any spindly growth removed, and you usually are going to need to do this on an annual basis. Now, I wouldn't prune a whole lot for the first couple of years after planting, but you do need to, as soon as the bushes are mature, and high bush begins about 6 years of age, and a half high about 3 or 4 years, and start doing regular pruning with those. So what are you actually going to remove? Well, for the first 2 years, all you remove are the flower buds because, again, you don't want it to be producing fruit. You want it to establish those first couple of years. Then you start doing your pruning for vigor, and you can do a lot of removal right down at the base. You need to keep in mind that your flowering buds and fruit buds are produced the previous year at the tips of the branches. So be sure not to prune off all your tips so that you don't lose all of your fruit. You'll note here in the picture that the fruit buds are a lot bigger than the vegetative buds, so it's easy to see in March or so what they look like. Now, towards the base of the 1-year-old wood, you'll see the vegetative buds, and they'll produce a shoot that has leaves the next season. So the best time to prune then is late February to March. You need to make sure the plants are still dormant. You don't want to prune too early in the year because sometimes this can lead to winter injury. So you don't want to prune in January or early February. Now you'll note during this dormant season that the newer growth will be red or green in color, and older wood or dead wood is going to be more grayish looking. Now you'll see here in the picture on the side, the two pictures, there's a before and after shot to kind of give you an idea of how much material you should remove. And you can remove up to 25% on high bush blueberries, slightly less than that on your half high blueberries. So again, the objectives are to promote strong new wood, and you want to keep a balance between fruit production and growth. So you'll notice if you look in the two pictures and compare them that they've taken out a lot of the weaker, smaller stems, but they also have removed a couple of the larger stems that are no longer productive. So what you want is, in the end, a vase-shaped kind of vertical plant that has a somewhat open center, and that allows light to penetrate. One of the first things to start looking for when you're starting your pruning program is you want to remove any crossing branches, especially ones that are growing into the center of the plant. Obviously any dead wood, because that's not productive. Any wood that looks diseased as well. And I would familiarize myself, if I were a blueberry grower, with what some of those diseases look like on the wood. Also remove canes that are over 6 years old because they start to become less productive, and again you want to encourage newer, more vigorous growth. Also remove any excess kind of weak twiggy wood, and again you're pruning for light penetration in the center. So this is simply another depiction of what your before and after pruning might be. You'll note that they took out most of the really big older canes and also removed a lot of the twigginess. Pruning is kind of an art form, and it takes a bit of practice to get really good at it, but it is something you can definitely develop an eye for. Okay, one of the other challenges that we have is that blueberries are susceptible to winter damage. So you should provide some winter protection against low temperatures, especially if you're in a rural area or in an 5A. Also keep in mind that snow load can be a factor to consider. Now, if you are using a raised bed and you are putting your plants under plastic for the winter, that actually can double as rodent protection and winter protection at the same time. Be sure and provide rabbit protection in winter and early spring. We learned that at our teaching garden when the rabbits got up into our raised beds and chewed our little blueberry plants right down to the nubbies. So we learned that lesson the hard way. There's a lot of different types of products out on the market. I've shown you here one product, not that that one's any better than any other one, but just to kind of give you an idea of what one of those products might look like. So you can use something as simple as chicken wire, or you can use something like the product that's depicted there. Also, remember snow depth, since that can be a factor to consider. So I'd like to leave you with some resources that you can use to learn more about growing blueberries. The first one is a resource from the Wisconsin Horticulture Team, which is a group of UW Extension educators and specialists that have banded together to provide resources for many horticultural enterprises. So there's a fact sheet at this site on growing blueberries in containers you might want to check out. Also, there is at the UW Extension Learning Store, an online site, a publication on home fruit cultivars for southern Wisconsin. There's also one on home fruit cultivars for northern Wisconsin if you happen to have property up north. Now, when you go to the Learning Store site, it may look like you need to purchase the product, in order to look at it, but you really don't. So what you need to do when you click on the icon is scroll down past the area where it gives you a price, and there will be a little gold box that says view this publication. You click on that and you can view the publication. Now Michigan State, they actually have a pretty big blueberry growing uh, industry there. I'm sure that if you've purchased blueberries at the grocery store, sometimes they do come from Michigan. So that one's another resource for you as well. So thank you for listening to this presentation on growing blueberries. If you do have questions about any facet of growing blueberries, please feel free to contact me at the phone number or email. Thank you.